Welcome to Planet Echoes. Tonight, we step into a world that should not exist. A world where the oceans themselves have vanished. Imagine standing at the edge of a cliff where waves once roared, only to find nothing but silence and a horizon of cracked salt plains stretching into infinity. The air is heavy, still, and carries no scent of salt or spray. The seagulls are gone. The tides are gone. Even the memory of water feels fragile, as though speaking of it too loudly might shatter the illusion that it had ever been real. What happens to a world when its beating blue heart is torn away? That is the question that haunted me from the first moment I stepped into the basin of what was once an ocean. I remember the ground trembling under my boots. It wasn't the rumble of waves striking rock or the groan of shifting tides. It was deeper, almost like the earth itself resented the emptiness above it. The seabed was cracked into jagged patterns, white veins of salt cutting through clay and stone. It felt alive, like an exposed wound. I knelt and touched the ground. It was dry, brittle, and when it broke apart beneath my fingers, a fine dust rose into the air and stung my lungs. The taste was strange, not salt, not earth, something in between, as if the planet had bled and left behind a residue of its loss. There were remnants, of course. Skeletons of ships lay on their sides, masts snapped, hulls split open, stranded as if caught mid-escape. They looked like bones of ancient leviathans, trapped forever in a desert that was never meant to exist. I walked past one such vessel, its wooden planks warped and splintered, and felt the uncanny sensation that someone had been here before me. Someone had stood where I stood, staring into the abyss of absence, wondering how a world could survive without its oceans. And yet survival was not the word that came to mind. It was abandonment, as though something vast and merciless had stripped the earth bare, erasing not just water but the very memory of it. The sun was merciless, scorching the seabed until it shimmered like glass. Heat rippled through the air, and in that heat I swore I heard voices, faint, fragmented, carried by no wind. They spoke of drowning, of waves, of storms long gone. Or maybe it was my own mind reaching for echoes that could no longer exist. The strangest thing was not the absence of water, but the presence of marks, symbols carved into the seabed itself, etched deep into stone as though something had used the retreat of the oceans to inscribe messages into the earth. They were not random. They curved and twisted like currents frozen in place, resembling neither language nor art, but something caught between. My eyes traced them. Though I could not understand their meaning, I felt a pulse of recognition. The lines led onward, further into the emptiness, as though inviting me to follow. I hesitated, not because I feared what I would find, but because I realised something. The disappearance of the oceans was not an accident. It was not drought, not evaporation, not time. It was deliberate. The sea had not drained. It had been taken, and the marks on the ground were not the aftermath of its loss. They were the reason for it. I rose to my feet, staring across the vast desert that had once been an endless expanse of waves. The symbols stretched out like a path, a map cut into the flesh of the world itself. Behind me, the skeletal ships groaned in the heat, their broken timbers creaking as though the ocean still clung to them in spirit. Ahead of me, silence. Endless, beckoning silence. I took a step forward, then another, following the carved lines deeper into the emptiness, each mark carrying me further from what I thought I knew. For in that moment, one thought pressed against my skull with unbearable weight. If the oceans could disappear, then perhaps they were never ours to begin with. And that is where the story begins, with a world stripped of its lifeblood and a question echoing louder than any tide. Who or what could have taken it? The lines were waiting for me in the distance, sharp and deliberate against the cracked earth, and I had no choice but to follow them. Each step carried me further into a landscape that seemed less like the remains of an ocean, and more like a stage prepared for something vast and unseen. The seabed beneath my boots shifted in colour, from chalky white to a darker metallic hue, as if the earth itself was changing skin. The etched lines deepened here, no longer faint scratches but deliberate carvings, their edges too sharp, too precise to be the work of erosion or accident. I felt the sting of unease prickling the back of my neck. This was not nature's hand, it was intention. The further I walked, the more the silence pressed in. Not the peaceful silence of a calm day, but a hollow, suffocating one. It felt orchestrated, like something had drained not only the water, but also the very ability of this place to breathe. My own heartbeat became unnaturally loud, echoing in my ears like a drum in a cave. I thought of the ships I had passed, their broken masts reaching toward the sun like pleading hands. They were not simply abandoned vessels, they were witnesses, left stranded on a stage after the curtain had fallen. What unsettled me most was the absence of life. No plants clung to the seabed. No insects darted across the cracks. No traces of bones from fish or whales that should have been buried here. It was as though the oceans had taken everything with them, down to the smallest trace of existence. The earth was too clean, too emptied, too deliberate. I could not shake the thought that this was not merely disappearance, but extraction. Something had stripped the seas and every living memory within them, leaving behind only the carved instructions in stone. The carvings themselves began to shift in form as I traced them with my eyes. At first they had resembled flowing currents, but now they sharpened into angular patterns like maps of constellations frozen into the ground. They radiated outward from a central point I had yet to reach. I felt as though I was being drawn not forward but downward, as though the lines carried me into a memory older than the earth itself. That was when I realised the symbols were not silent. When I crouched close, pressing my ear toward the stone, I heard the faintest hum, low and resonant, as if the ground vibrated with a frequency too deep for casual hearing. It pulsed faintly, a rhythm that reminded me of waves breaking, though no waves existed here anymore. It was impossible, and yet I felt it, through my skin, in my chest, the whisper of a tide long gone but not forgotten. I stood again, my throat dry, the heat pressing harder. The horizon seemed to ripple like water, though I knew it was a trick of exhaustion and light. Still, I could not shake the image. A mirage of the ocean trying to return, flickering across the salt and stone. What if it was not a mirage at all? What if the seas had not been destroyed but displaced? And if displaced, then to where? The idea was absurd, and yet every step I took made it harder to dismiss. The ground beneath me was not dead, but humming, alive with the memory of what had been taken. I thought of the old myths, oceans hidden beneath the earth, seas swallowed by gods, waters stolen by the sky. Could those myths have been echoes of this? Not prophecy, but remembrance. The carvings grew bolder as I pressed on. They glowed faintly in the harsh sun, as though the stone itself retained some unearthly charge. My mind whispered questions I could not silence. Were these warnings or directions? Had someone tried to show us what had happened, or had they left this map for reasons I could not yet comprehend? I followed the lines step after step until I reached a vast fissure in the seabed. It gaped open like the wound of a planet, black and bottomless, its edges carved with the same deliberate marks. I stood at its rim, the hum vibrating stronger here, reverberating through my bones. The fissure was not natural. It was a door, waiting. The silence pressed tighter, and I knew that once I crossed that threshold, there would be no turning back. I inhaled the dry, burning air and felt the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes. The choice was no longer mine. It had been made the moment I touched the first carving, and so I stepped closer, peering into the abyss that had swallowed the sea. And in the depthless dark I saw the first glimmer of movement. It was faint, like a ripple of silver caught in a current that no longer existed. I leaned over the fissure, my breath shallow, and watched as the glimmer swelled, then retreated, like a heartbeat pulsing in the earth's hidden arteries. The seabed hummed louder, vibrating up through my boots, and for a moment I thought I felt the pull of a tide against my skin, a phantom tide, unseen but undeniable. My instincts screamed to step back, yet some deeper instinct whispered to remain. The abyss was showing me something it had been waiting to reveal. The movement coalesced, forming not into shapes of creatures, but into streams of light. They wove like schools of fish, but their bodies were pure radiance, strands of liquid fire flowing silently in the dark. I blinked hard, wondering if heat and exhaustion had driven me into visions. But the carvings on the fisher's rim pulsed in rhythm with the lights, and I realised they were connected. The symbols were a language, and this was their answer. The realisation terrified me more than the silence. If these lights responded, then something down there was aware. And if it was aware, then perhaps it had taken the oceans for a purpose far beyond human comprehension. I crouched, my hand hovering over one of the etched lines glowing faintly in the stone. The moment my skin brushed its surface, the hum intensified into a tone that resonated deep in my chest, so low it bordered on unbearable. I felt it vibrating in my bones, as if my body itself had become part of the message. The lights below flared brighter, then dimmed, as though acknowledging me. For the first time I wondered not just what had stolen the oceans, but whether I had been meant to find this place. A strange thought wormed into my mind, not my own, but implanted, soft and insistent. The oceans were not gone, they were hidden. The lights pulsed with the weight of that truth, and my mouth went dry. Hidden where? Beneath us, above us, somewhere beyond reach, and if hidden, then by whom? I pulled back sharply, gasping, the vision breaking. The fissure seemed darker now, its depths infinite, yet still alive with faint glimmers. My hands trembled. I told myself it was only exhaustion, only the tricks of a scorched mind walking too long across dead salt plains. Yet deep inside, I knew what I saw had been real. I turned away, trying to steady my breathing, but the carving stretched further, leading beyond the fissure into another stretch of seabed. They no longer resembled constellations or currents. Now they aligned into something far more human. Pathways, intersections, the blueprints of a city. My chest tightened. A city at the bottom of the sea, etched into the stone long after the waters had gone. Or had it existed before the waters came? The silence around me deepened, as if the world itself was listening for my next move. My boots cracked over the brittle surface as I followed the new lines, eyes tracing the outlines of what could only be streets and foundations. I was walking through the skeleton of something impossible, something erased from every map. A thought haunted me as I moved deeper into the city's ghostly outline. Perhaps the oceans had not been taken at all. Perhaps they had been used, drained like lifeblood to feed something vast, something capable of inscribing entire cities into the bones of the world. The glimmer in the fissure had not been water. It had been residue, the remnants of what still flowed elsewhere, far from human eyes. I paused at the centre of the etched city. A circle had been carved here, its diameter stretching wider than a ship's deck, its lines sharper than any tool could have managed on brittle stone. I stood at its edge, sensing that it marked not just a place, but a purpose. The carvings here were different, no longer abstract, no longer flowing. They resembled hands raised upward, not in prayer but in surrender. The weight of that image pressed against my mind. Who had carved this city? Who had raised their hands in surrender beneath a vanished sea? And who or what had forced them to? A whisper curled at the edge of my hearing, almost too faint to grasp, yet undeniable. It was not a word, not in any language I knew, but a command that lodged itself deep inside me. Remember. I stumbled back, dizzy, the circle burning in my vision. The seabed was alive with memory, and I was only beginning to unravel what it had chosen to show me. The city beneath my feet was not a ruin. It was a record, and I was walking on the pages of a history meant to be erased. And still, from the fissure behind me, the glimmer pulsed, reminding me that the oceans were not lost, only waiting. The word echoed in my chest. Waiting. The thought that the oceans themselves could be in a state of suspension unsettled me more deeply than their absence. It suggested they were not simply gone, but held somewhere, as though the world's lifeblood had been captured in a vessel I could not yet see. My feet carried me forward, though my eyes lingered on the fissure behind me, afraid that if I looked too long, it might swallow me whole. The city etched beneath my feet stretched onward, its ghostly streets beckoning me deeper, every line a silent demand for witness. The circle with its raised hands haunted me most. I traced the shapes again with my eyes, and the message became clear. This was not surrender to the sea. It was surrender to something that had taken it. The realization cut through me, sharp and cold. Humanity had always assumed the oceans were eternal, beyond the grasp of gods or men. But the evidence beneath me suggested otherwise. If they could be taken once, could they be taken again? I pressed onward, the air shimmering with heat, until I reached a formation that broke the monotony of cracks and carvings. A stone pillar rose from the seabed, jagged but deliberate, as though it had been forced upward by a hand beneath the earth. Around its base, the carvings thickened, spiralling into patterns that seemed to move when I looked at them too long. I approached cautiously, placing a palm against the surface. The stone was warm, unnaturally so, radiating not from the sun but from within. I closed my eyes, and once again the hum rose. No longer a whisper but a chant, layered voices pressing into my mind. They spoke in a rhythm I almost recognized, like the crash of waves against cliffs, like the roar of a tide racing to shore. And within that rhythm, one sound repeated, a name I could not decipher, heavy and foreign, yet it clawed its way into me until I mouthed it without meaning to. The instant I did, the pillar shuddered. Dust fell from its sides, and the carvings flared with faint light, illuminating the dry seabed around me. The city's map came alive, glowing lines etching themselves into clarity. Streets, plazas, halls. It was no mere sketch, but a design, an imprint of something that had stood here before the sea itself. The truth pressed in with unbearable weight. The city had existed first, the water had come later, the oceans had hidden it, preserved it, and now that they were gone, the city demanded to be remembered. My knees weakened beneath the force of revelation. Everything I had believed about history, about the natural order, was shattering in that glowing vision. What else had the oceans hidden? What else lay beneath the blue veil of waves, waiting for their disappearance to expose the truth? The glow dimmed suddenly, leaving me in scorching daylight once more. The silence returned like a blow, thick and oppressive, but I no longer felt alone. The fissure behind me still pulsed faintly, and now the pillar seemed to breathe, heat rising from its core as though it waited for more from me. Another word, another act of surrender. I stumbled back, gasping, torn between dread and compulsion. My mind reeled with questions. Who built this city before the oceans? Why was it etched into the bones of the earth as though it were never meant to vanish? And why did the very act of speaking its forgotten name awaken something beneath my feet? I turned in a slow circle, taking in the vast desolation of the drained seabed. No horizon of waves, no cries of gulls, no salt spray. Just the memory of an ocean that had been more prison than sanctuary, holding something older, something waiting. The thought twisted inside me until it became unbearable. What if the oceans had never been for us? What if they were meant to hold back something too immense for human eyes, and now that they were gone, that something was free? My body trembled as I backed away from the pillar. The hum inside my chest had not faded. It had lodged itself into me, as though I had carried a fragment of that chant away. The seabed city lay beneath my boots like a question with no answer, but the fissure behind me throbbed louder, and the glimmer within seemed brighter now, no longer distant but closer, as though it knew I was listening. And then, carried on the suffocating silence, a sound broke through. Not a hum, not a chant, but the unmistakable rush of water, rising from a place where no water remained. These sounds struck me like a phantom tide, an echo of something that should not exist. My ears strained, searching for its source, but the seabed around me remained dry, cracked, and mercilessly bare. Yet the roar persisted, faint at first, then stronger, swelling as though invisible waves were gathering crashing against unseen shores. My heart hammered with the impossible rhythm. Could absence carry a voice? Could emptiness roar? I turned sharply toward the fissure. Its depths, once still except for the glimmer, now shimmered with motion. Light cascaded within, flickering like reflections on water, though no liquid filled that abyss. The rush grew louder, and my instincts told me to flee, to put as much distance as I could between myself and that impossible sound. But something greater than fear rooted me in place. It was not just curiosity, it was recognition. I had heard this sound before, not here, but in dreams I could never explain. Nights ago, before I ever walked the drained seabed, I woke with my sheets damp, my lungs burning as though I had swallowed seawater. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of sleep, an echo of memory. But now that same flood roared in my ears, not in dream but in waking. The fissure was not showing me water. It was reaching into me, calling out what it had already placed there long before. I staggered closer to the rim. The carvings along its edge glowed faintly, pulsing in rhythm with the sound, each beat sinking to the phantom tide. I lowered to my knees, my fingers brushing the marks, and the roar intensified until it filled me completely, drowning every thought but one. The oceans had not disappeared. They had been pulled through. To where I still could not imagine, but the fissure was no void. It was a channel. The realization burned in me. A channel meant passage, meant intent. The seas had not dried. They had been moved, swept away like a tide retreating into some other place, some other world. My skin prickled with dread at the enormity of it. If they were moved, then whoever had moved them could return. The roar softened, shifting into something stranger. Voices interlaced with water. Not human voices, but deep, resonant, like whales singing in a register no ear should capture. They did not form words I knew, yet meaning seeped into me all the same. We are not gone. We are beneath. We wait. The voices were not cries of the drowned. They were not laments of what had been lost. They were warnings. I jerked my hand back from the carvings, my body trembling, the echoes of that alien chorus still vibrating inside me. I wanted to scream, to break the silence with my own voice, but I feared what might answer. The seabed around me shifted with heat, the air shimmering, the city's ghostly etchings glowing faintly again. The pillar in the distance radiated stronger, as though feeding on the fissure's surge. My breath grew ragged, sweat burning into my eyes. I realized the carvings were not scattered messages, but a network, a system binding the seabed, connecting the fissure, the pillar, and the etched city into one vast design. Stepped back, dizzy with the enormity of what I was seeing. This was no ruin, it was a mechanism, and the oceans had been its fuel. The sound of rushing water ebbed suddenly, leaving the silence raw and piercing. The fissure dimmed again, the glimmers sinking deeper, vanishing from sight. I stared into the darkness, my pulse unsteady. Whatever had shown itself to me had retreated, but not entirely. I could still feel its presence, waiting, listening, patient as the tide. I turned away at last, staggering into the ghostly streets carved across the seabed. The silence returned, but it no longer felt empty. It pressed against me with intention, as though the world itself was holding its breath. And in that stillness one final truth lodged itself into my mind. If the oceans could be moved, then so could we. The thought struck me with the weight of inevitability. If entire seas could be shifted, erased from sight and memory, what was humanity but another fluid mass waiting to be displaced? We pride ourselves on permanence, cities built on stone, histories carved into monuments, yet compared to the oceans we are fragile, temporary. And if even the oceans could be stolen, then all our certainties were illusions. I stood there, my body trembling against the heat of the seabed, staring down at the etched streets of the ghost city, realizing we might not be the first to be moved. The carvings no longer seemed like abstract marks, but instructions, diagrams of transition. Every line, every curve resembled a current, a flow not of water, but of entire worlds. Thought turned my stomach cold. Could this city have been lifted, transported, carried elsewhere as easily as the seas themselves? Perhaps what I was standing on was not just a ruin, but the residue of a civilization that had already been displaced. A shadow cut across the ground. I froze, heart hammering. There was nothing above me, no birds, no clouds, and yet something vast had passed overhead, its outline briefly staining the baked seabed before dissolving into nothingness. The silence grew heavier. My throat tightened as I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light, a hallucination born of heat and fear. But then the ground beneath my boots pulsed again, faint but certain, like a heartbeat. I dropped to one knee, pressing my hand flat to the cracked stone. The hum was stronger now, resonating upward, carrying with it the same rhythm I had heard before, the rhythm of waves, of cycles, of inevitability. My skin prickled as if touched by phantom currents. The whisper returned, "Remember." This time it was not a word in my head, but a voice in my chest, vibrating through my ribs. I staggered back, clutching myself, the air around me suddenly thick, almost liquid. For a heartbeat I could not breathe. I felt submerged in an ocean that was no longer visible, yet entirely present. My lungs burned, my vision blurred, and I nearly collapsed, until, just as quickly, the pressure released. I gasped, choking on air, drenched in sweat. It left me shaken, but also certain. The oceans had not left. They surrounded me still, displaced into some layer beyond sight, pressing against this barren reality like water against glass. And perhaps, with the right act, with the right word, that veil could break. The fissure glowed faintly behind me. The pillar throbbed with heat. The city stretched onward in silent design. Each piece was part of a greater system, and I was walking through its centre. My fear grew heavier with every realization. If this system could take the oceans, what else had it taken? What else might it take again? I stumbled forward, deeper into the city's etched heart. The silence followed like a shadow, but beneath it I began to hear faint echoes. Not water, not hums, but the sound of footsteps. I froze. They were not mine. Slow, deliberate, moving across stone that should have been lifeless. I spun, searching the empty seabed, but nothing stirred. The echoes continued, surrounding me, drawing closer. My pulse thundered. I was no longer alone. I called out, a whisper, barely more than breath. But the silence devoured my voice. The footsteps paused. For a long, breathless moment, nothing moved. Then, from the fissure, the glimmer brightened once more, and I realised the truth. The steps were not approaching across the ground. They were rising from below. The air thickened again, carrying with it a presence too vast to name. I backed away, but the city's etched streets seemed to close around me, funneling me toward the circle of raised hands. I tried to resist, but every path curved back toward it, every line a corridor pointing me to the same centre. I stopped at its edge, chest heaving, staring down at the carved hand surrendering to the sky. And then, for the first time, I heard a word. Not a whisper, not a hum, but a word spoken with clarity, reverberating from the fissure itself. Return. The ground quivered beneath me. The fissure's glow spread, seeping into the carvings, igniting the circle in blinding light. I staggered back, but the seabed itself pulsed as though alive, drawing me closer. And in that moment, one thought carved itself into my mind with terrible precision. This was not a city built by humans. It was a design built for them. The difference was not subtle. It was devastating. Humans carve, build, and adapt for their survival. But this city was not born of need. It was shaped with foresight, with a purpose I could not yet comprehend, as though every etched street, every spiralling symbol, had been waiting for human arrival long before we ever existed. I felt the ground beneath me as a script, and I was merely the actor walking lines written by something greater. I turned in circles, sweat pouring down my face, scanning the skeletal blueprint beneath my boots. The streets converged on the circle with its carved hands, like rivers returning to the sea. Except the sea was gone. It struck me suddenly that the oceans might have only ever been camouflage, a vast cloak of water meant to conceal this design until the moment of unveiling. But who had orchestrated such a thing, and why? The fissure pulsed again, and the word I had heard, return, echoed in the silence of my mind. It was not a command delivered once, but a constant repeating message, rippling through every stone and line around me. I shuddered as I realised it was not directed at me alone. It was directed at humanity itself. Return. But return to what? To where? I crouched low, tracing the carvings with my fingers. They responded faintly, glowing like veins under skin, their hum resonating with my heartbeat. They weren't random symbols. They were coordinates, equations, mechanisms hidden in plain sight. The city was a machine, and the ocean had been its power source. My mind reeled at the scale of it. If the oceans could be drained, displaced, used, then all the energy we thought was ours had never belonged to us at all. We had been living on borrowed tides. A sharp crack split the silence. My head snapped up. Across the seabed, near the pillar that rose jagged and defiant, the stone fractured, shedding shards of dust. Something moved within the break. Slow, deliberate, like a creature stirring in its sleep. My skin tightened as I realised that the seabed was not as lifeless as it appeared. It was stirring, awakening. The silence thickened, but beneath it I felt the phantom sound of rushing water again, as though a wave was gathering just beyond sight. My pulse quickened. If the oceans had been hidden, was this their way back? Or worse, was this the first sign of something that had been held beneath them, now free to rise? I stumbled back from the circle, my breath ragged. For the first time, doubt gnawed at me more than curiosity. I wanted to turn, to run across the endless salt flats, to escape the design pressing itself into my bones. But even as the thought formed, the carvings beneath my feet glowed brighter, the lines stretching toward the fissure, toward the pillar, locking me into their geometry. There was no outside, only inside. The fissure's glow intensified, its depths alive with pulsing light. The footsteps I'd heard before returned, closer now, rising with the rhythm of the phantom tide. I pressed my palms to my ears, desperate to block them out, but they echoed inside my chest, not outside. They were footsteps without weight, without bodies. They were the echoes of those who had walked this place long before me, those who had obeyed the call to return. A memory sharp and sudden pierced through me, the raised hands carved in surrender, not of defeat, of offering. Had they lifted their hands not to the ocean, but to what lay beneath it? Had they surrendered themselves willingly into whatever mechanism this city was designed to awaken? My body shivered. I felt less like an intruder now and more like a participant. The city was not showing me its secrets to frighten me away. It was testing me, guiding me, seeing if I could bear the truth. And against every instinct, I realized I was walking the same path as those who had raised their hands before me. The pillar shuddered again, louder this time, sending vibrations racing through the seabed. The fissure blazed with light. The city's lines glowed until the entire ground pulsed beneath me like a living heart. My legs shook, but I could not move. The mechanism was no longer dormant. It was awakening. And in that rising hum, that deafening silence alive with sound, I heard the voices again, layered and endless. The oceans were never yours. The words crushed the air from my lungs, and I stumbled to my knees, gasping, tears stinging my eyes from heat and terror. And as the voices faded, another truth slipped through, whispered only once, so faint I almost believed I had imagined it. "You're next." The words lingered in me like poison, threading themselves into every vein until I could feel their weight in my blood. "You are next." The thought throbbed with each heartbeat. Impossible to ignore, impossible to silence. I rose unsteadily, my legs weak, as though the seabed itself had drained me of strength. The fissure's glow had dimmed again, but the damage was done. It had spoken, and I had heard. I looked around the skeletal map of the city, its lines still faintly glowing in the scorching air, and it struck me that perhaps I had misunderstood everything. The oceans had not been taken as punishment, nor had they been hidden for protection. They had been moved because they were finished. Their purpose had ended, and now humanity's purpose was ending too. The realization chilled me more than the sun could burn. The silence pressed in once more, but it was no longer the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of expectation, as if the seabed itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do next. I stumbled toward the pillar, its heat radiating stronger, almost unbearable. Dust flaked from its surface, revealing sharper carvings beneath, lines that curved into forms resembling figures, tall and featureless, their arms extended outward. They looked neither human nor monstrous. They looked like placeholders, waiting to be filled. My stomach turned. Were these the builders, or were they templates, the shapes into which humanity itself was meant to be poured when the time came? I touched the stone, and for an instant I felt my own outline dissolve into something larger, my form bending, reshaping, as though I was being compared to a design not my own. I ripped my hand back, shuddering, my breath ragged. The fissure pulsed again behind me, and in that light I thought I saw movement. Tall shadows walking the etched streets, their steps soundless, their forms fluid, like water given shape. They did not approach, they only moved, endlessly tracing the city's lines as though rehearsing the pattern for eternity. My heart thundered. Were these echoes of those who came before, or glimpses of what we would become once we, too, were displaced? I tried to turn away, but my eyes clung to them, mesmerized by their fluidity. They did not resist the city's design. They flowed within it, as though the blueprint beneath us was not a trap but a channel, guiding, shaping, fulfilling. The whisper returned in my skull, not as a voice but as a memory surfacing, return. And suddenly I understood. The oceans were not stolen. They were recalled, drawn back to a source that had always owned them. And humanity, like the seas, was never truly free. We were tenants of the earth, living on borrowed time, borrowed waters, borrowed sky. We had mistaken it all for ours, but the owners were calling it back. I collapsed to my knees in the circle of carved hands, my palms pressed to the scorched stone. The hum rose again, filling me until my ribs rattled with the force of it. Tears blurred my vision, though I could not say if they were mine or drawn from me by the seabed itself. I wanted to resist. I wanted to scream that we were more than this, that we had earned our place in the world. But my voice would not rise. My throat tightened, strangled by silence. The shadows moved closer now, their faceless heads turning toward me. They raised their arms in the same gesture as the carved hands, not in violence, not in threat, but in acceptance. It was surrender, yes, but not of defeat. It was surrender to inevitability, to the design written in stone and tide long before I was born. The fissure flared, blinding white for a heartbeat, and in that light I glimpsed what lay below. Not darkness, not abyss, but movement. Oceans, endless and alive, churning in silence as though they had been folded beneath the world, waiting for the call to rise again. My breath hitched, my chest tightening with awe and terror. The light dimmed, leaving me shaken, the shadows receding back into their endless circuit of the city's lines. The silence fell once more, thick and watchful, and in that unbearable quiet one thought consumed me. If the oceans were already waiting, then perhaps humanity's turn had already begun. The possibility crawled over my skin like ice. I stood frozen at the circle's edge, staring down at the raised hands carved into the stone, imagining that they were not the hands of an ancient people at all but our own, raised in a moment yet to come, carved into prophecy. Perhaps we were already being written into the same blueprint, pulled toward the same surrender, and none of us had even noticed. The oceans had been taken with a silence so complete, the world above had carried on without mourning. Could the same erasure already be happening to us, piece by piece, memory by memory, until nothing remained but outlines carved in stone? The silence thickened as I thought it, almost as if the seabed itself approved of my conclusion. The fissure pulsed faintly, the light within it dim yet steady, like a heartbeat hidden beneath a rib cage. My eyes drifted toward it against my will, drawn not by curiosity but by gravity, as if my body knew its centre of belonging lay there. A sick realization gnawed at me. If humanity's turn had begun, then I was not an observer. I was part of it. I staggered back, away from the fissure, my chest heaving. The heat of the pillar seared against my back, pressing me forward again, forcing me to remain within the geometry. I was trapped between the two, a living pawn inside a pattern that stretched far beyond my comprehension. My mind whispered questions that burned like fire. Who designed this? Why had the oceans been recalled first? And why was I the one chosen to see it? I thought of the phantom footsteps I'd heard, the fluid shadows pacing the city's lines. They had not threatened me, not directly, but their presence had been suffocating. What if they were not echoes of the past, but heralds of the future? What if they were not memories of those who came before, but glimpses of what we would become once we answered the call to return? My throat tightened with the terror of it. Would we even recognize ourselves after such a transition? Or would we dissolve into formless shadows, endlessly rehearsing the design carved into the seabed? The hum returned, low and resonant, vibrating up through my boots, through my bones until I could feel it in my teeth. It was not random, it was summoning. The word formed itself in the resonance once more. Return. The same word over and over, each repetition louder, until the silence itself felt like it was being rewritten into sound. I dropped to my knees, clutching my head. The word pierced deeper than language, cutting into me like an order written into marrow. Return. I wanted to fight it, to shout against it, but the strength in me was ebbing, siphoned into the hum. My thoughts blurred. My will felt like sand slipping through fingers. And then the vision came, not of oceans, not of fissures, but of the sky. I saw it boiling, splitting apart as though it too were only a veil. Behind it churned something endless and black, streaked with faint lines of light, not stars but currents, vast rivers flowing beyond the firmament. The oceans were there, carried along those cosmic rivers, their waves silent but furious, waiting to be poured back into the world. And within them I glimpsed shapes moving, enormous and ancient, like whales made of shadow and flame. They had not drowned. They had not died. They had been transported. The vision broke as suddenly as it came, and I collapsed onto the brittle stone, gasping, drenched in sweat. My limbs trembled, my body weaker than before, as though the glimpse had cost me more than I could afford. The fissure pulsed softly, as though satisfied with what it had shown me. The silence fell again, but it was no longer oppressive. It was patient. Patient because it knew what I now knew. That humanity was not merely next, but already chosen. I dragged myself upright, swaying, my body screaming to collapse again. My gaze swept across the city's lines, the glowing circle, the pillar, and the fissure. They were not fragments of mystery, they were steps, a sequence, and I was already standing at the final threshold. The thought struck me with clarity that hollowed me out. The oceans had not been the first to be moved. The idea clawed at me, unbearable in its implications. If the seas were not the beginning, then what had been taken before them? I looked around the etched city, its glowing lines weaving their geometry into the bones of the earth, and suddenly the silence no longer felt empty. It felt layered, crowded with absence. How many civilizations, how many worlds had stood here before us and vanished into that same fissure, recalled like tides retreating at an unseen command? The raised hands etched into the circle seemed to shift under my gaze. They no longer resembled surrender alone. They looked like warning, like testimony from those who had already been claimed. A shiver crawled down my spine. Perhaps their last act had been to leave behind this map, hoping someone would understand. But the city's design was not built to save us. It was built to prepare us for the same fate. The fissure pulsed again, and this time the light spilled outward, streaking across the seabed until it licked at the base of the pillar. The carvings ignited, glowing so brightly I could not look at them directly. The hummer roared in my chest until I thought my ribs might crack. The word came again, unmistakable and final. Return. But layered beneath it now was another sound. A scream. Not human, not animal, but something vast and hollow, as though the earth itself had split in anguish. My knees buckled under the force of it. The seabed trembled. Dust rose in plumes from the cracked earth. I clutched the ground, terrified the fissure would widen and swallow me whole. Instead, something else happened. The pillar fractured down its length, revealing a core of blinding light. Within it, shadows writhed. Not shapes I could name, but impressions of movement, like memories trapped in stone. Faces blurred, dissolving into waves, then into dust. I knew them without knowing. They were the ones who had been moved before us. Their essence had been folded into this mechanism, preserved not as living beings but as patterns, echoes woven into the earth's geometry. I stumbled back, choking on dry air. My thoughts reeled with horror. The oceans had not been the first, but they had been the most visible. Something older, something nameless had gone before them. Entire lives, entire histories stripped and placed elsewhere. The silence of the world was not natural. It was curated, sculpted by absence, polished clean by the erasure of what had come before. I stared at the fissure, heart hammering. If the oceans had been recalled, then where were they now? Where had those before us been carried? And what if, once taken, there was no return at all, only a reshaping into shadows that haunted the seabed forever? The hum rose again, drowning my panic, pulling me upright like a puppet on strings. My arms trembled, lifting against my will, mirroring the carved hands of the circle. The design was drawing me in. The city was not merely waiting for witness, it was waiting for submission. My lips moved, forming words I did not understand, syllables that cut the air with unnatural precision. Each one unlocked something deeper in the mechanism. The fissure flared, the pillar roared, the ground pulsed. And then I saw it. Not in vision, not in dream, but with open eyes. The seabed peeled away layer by layer, as though the earth itself was only a veil. Beneath it churned rivers of light, endless, rushing, carrying with them fragments of oceans, fragments of memory, fragments of entire worlds. The magnitude of it was unbearable. Not water alone, but existence itself flowing through channels far older than any human history. My body shook with terror and awe. We were not the masters of this world. We were passengers, and the world itself was not solid ground, but a vessel designed to move us when the time came. The word struck again, thunderous and final. Return. I collapsed, my arms falling limp, my chest heaving with ragged breath. The fissure dimmed, the glow receding, leaving only silence once more. But the truth had been revealed, and it was more devastating than anything I could bear. The oceans had not been the first. Humanity would not be the last. The words settled into me like stone, heavier than any truth I had ever carried. I felt small, a flicker of existence caught in an endless cycle of displacement. A pawn in a game whose rules had been etched long before I drew breath. The seabed beneath my feet seemed to breathe with that knowledge, its cracks no longer random but veins of intention, coursing with memory far older than me. The silence was unbearable, yet I knew it was not true silence. It was waiting. My thoughts churned in chaos. What had come before the oceans? What kind of being or world had been shifted, erased, folded into the currents of light beneath the earth? I tried to picture them. Not humans, not even creatures I could name, but something vast, intelligent and forgotten. Their surrender carved into stone like a message for the next in line. My skin crawled. We were inheritors of a cycle we did not choose, and now it was our turn to be written into the blueprint. I staggered toward the fissure again, compelled and terrified, my boots cracking over brittle stone. Its depths no longer looked empty but swollen with promise, as though a tide was swelling behind glass. The faint glimmers moved, restless, weaving currents that mirrored the etchings on the seabed. I could almost convince myself the oceans themselves were watching me, listening, judging whether I was ready to be taken. The pillar groaned behind me, a sound deep as mountains shifting. I spun, my heart hammering, and saw the cracks widening along its length. More of the light spilled from within, revealing shapes that moved like smoke. Indistinct, faceless, but pressing outward as though straining to escape their prison of stone. I backed away, my hands trembling. Were these the ones before the oceans? Were they what remained when the cycle ended? The hum swelled again, pressing into me until my teeth ached. It was not just sound anymore. It was memory, bleeding into my mind, filling it with images that were not mine. I saw a world drowned in storms, towers swallowed whole as the oceans rose, then receded into nothing. I saw cities built in deserts of salt, only to be erased by light that came from beneath, not above. And I saw figures raising their hands, always raising their hands, surrender written into every age. The vision tore through me, leaving me gasping, clutching my skull, as if I could claw the memories out. But they stayed, burned into me. I understood now that the blueprint beneath me was not just a map. It was a chronicle. Every carving, every spiral, every hand had been a page of this same repeating story. And I was standing in the latest chapter, a witness and perhaps a participant. A surge of defiance sparked within me. I wanted to scream at the figure, at the pillar, at the silence itself. I wanted to demand why. Why us? Why now? Why oceans first, then humanity next? But my throat constricted before I could speak. It wasn't fear, it was suppression, as though the city itself would not allow such a question to pass into sound. Tears stung my eyes as rage twisted into despair, to realise we were never free, that everything we built, everything we cherished was only temporary scaffolding before the inevitable erasure. It hollowed me out. The thought of children playing in streets, of laughter carried on winds, of songs sung across generations, all of it suddenly seemed unbearably fragile. What was the point of memory if it could all be wiped away with the same precision as an ocean drained from its basin? And yet, even as despair consumed me, another thought burned like a coal in the ashes. Maybe those before us had left this city not as a tomb, but as a warning. Maybe their surrender had not been choice, but resignation. And maybe, just maybe, we could be different. The fissure pulsed sharply, as if it had heard my thought and rejected it. The hum spiked until I collapsed to my knees, my arms braced against the burning stone. The light flared in the pillar, the shadows inside writhing with fury, pressing harder against their prison. The design was not passive. It was alive, resisting my defiance, insisting on obedience. I clenched my teeth, forcing myself upright again. My body shook, my chest heaving. But I did not raise. My hands, not yet. The carvings beneath me glowed brighter, warning, demanding. But I remained still, silent, unwilling to surrender. For if humanity was next, then I needed to know one thing before I let go. Who had taken the first? The question echoed inside me like a stone dropped into bottomless water. Who had taken the first? Who had the power to drain oceans, to shift worlds, to fold civilizations into silence? The fissure gave no answer, only its steady pulse, light flaring faintly like a heartbeat beneath the earth. The pillar groaned again, dust flaking away as the shadows pressed harder from within. They seemed restless, agitated by my defiance, as though my refusal to surrender was a disruption in the design. I stood unsteadily, my body trembling, but my mind sharper than ever. I would not accept the silence. If the city was a mechanism, then it had builders. If the oceans were displaced, then there was a destination. And if I was next, then I would at least face it with eyes open. The carvings underfoot shifted as though alive. Their glow changed, their shapes bending, reforming into spirals that spread outward like ripples. They drew me toward the fissure again, the air shimmering with heat as the hum deepened. My heart thundered. I stepped closer, peering into the abyss, and for the first time the glimmers resolved into form. I saw eyes. Not human, not even animal, but vast orbs of light suspended in the darkness, turning upward to meet mine. My breath caught. They were not reflections, not illusions. They were watching me, watching through layers of earth and memory, patient and endless. The word returned, heavy as stone pressed onto my chest. Return. I staggered back, but the eyes did not fade. They remained fixed on me, unblinking, as though waiting for me to respond. My throat went dry. Whoever had taken the first was still here, still beneath me, still orchestrating every pulse of light, every hum in the stone. They were not gone. They had never left. The realization tore through me like lightning. The oceans were not stolen by absence. They were claimed by presence. Something beneath the earth, something vast, ancient and unspeakable, had taken them back. I gripped my temples, my mind burning with questions. Why the oceans first? Why civilizations before them? Why humanity now? The silence gave no reason. It offered only inevitability. My anger flared again, hot and useless against the suffocating truth. Were we nothing but resources to be moved, harvested, consumed in cycles beyond our comprehension? The shadows within the pillar writhed harder, their forms twisting into sharper figures, almost human now, almost familiar. My stomach twisted at the sight. Were these once like us, taken, reshaped, pressed into templates for whatever force waited in the fissure? The thought clawed at me until I could barely breathe, and yet deep beneath the terror another sensation stirred. Not despair, not submission, but a terrible recognition. Part of me felt the hum as comfort, the word return not as command but as invitation. What if this was not erasure but transformation? What if the ones taken before had not been destroyed but remade, carried into some larger existence beyond my grasp? My body shivered with dread, but my soul leaned forward, pulled toward the possibility of more. I clenched my fists, forcing the thought away. Hope was the most dangerous deception of all. If this was transformation, then why the shadows? Why the silence? Why the surrender carved in hands, raised not in joy but in despair? No, this was not transcendence. It was consumption, and I would not go willingly. The fissure pulsed again, brighter now, the eyes flaring with intensity. The word thundered, shaking the seabed, the pillar, the air itself. Return. My ears rang, my body convulsed, and yet I forced myself to remain standing. My lips formed one word, barely audible, trembling but defiant. No, the silence that followed was suffocating. The fissure dimmed, the pillar stilled, the hum receded. For a moment I thought I had broken it, that my resistance had fractured the cycle. But then the ground beneath me split with a crack like thunder, and light surged upward in a violent torrent, swallowing everything in its path. And in that light, I heard a voice unlike the others. Not a chant, not a command, but something sharper, colder, intimate. It spoke only to me. "You're already chosen." The words hollowed me out, erasing any illusion of escape. I stood in the scorched silence of the seabed, my chest heaving, my body trembling with the weight of that revelation. Already chosen. The words threaded themselves through me like iron shackles, unbreakable, final. There had been no choice, not from the beginning. I had not stumbled into this place by accident, nor had I resisted by my own will. Every step I had taken had been written, carved into the geometry long before my feet touched the stone. The fissure pulsed faintly, as if it approved of my despair. The glow spread slowly across the cracks in the earth, veins of light crawling outward in deliberate rhythm, like a heart pumping lifeblood. I could no longer tell where the seabed ended and the mechanism began. Perhaps they had always been the same. Perhaps the world itself was only the shell of this ancient design, waiting for its next act of reclamation. My knees buckled, and I fell into the dust. My palms scraped against the brittle salt crust of what had once been an ocean floor. For the first time I felt the weight of grief, not just for myself, but for all of us. Every city built on coasts, every life shaped by waves and tides, every child who once dreamed of the sea. All of it had only been a borrowed stage, a temporary lull before the curtain was pulled away. And now, if we were already chosen, then our laughter, our history, our songs were already marked for silence. A tremor rippled through the ground, gentle but relentless, as though the seabed itself were breathing beneath me. I forced myself upright, swaying, staring once more at the circle of carved hands. They seemed to rise higher now, their etched fingers reaching toward the sky in desperation. I wondered how many before me had stood in this same place, clinging to the hope that they were different, that they could resist. And I wondered if they too had been told the same words, already chosen. The thought hollowed me further. Was my resistance meaningless? Was defiance only another step in the pattern, necessary to bring me closer to surrender? I pressed my fist to my temples, shaking, rage and despair warring inside me. My voice broke free at last, hoarse and ragged. Why? Why us? Why take what lives? The seabed answered not with words, but with a vision. The fissure flared, flooding the world with blinding light. My eyes burned, but I could not look away. I saw the oceans as they had been, endless and alive, cradling continents in their blue embrace. Then, in a single instant, they were gone, folding downward like cloth torn from a table. In their absence rose towers of light, cities that were not ours, vast and impossible, their spires dissolving into currents of fire and shadow. I gasped as the vision shifted, showing me figures, tall, faceless, fluid, drifting through those towers like currents given shape. They were not human, not even alive in the way I understood. They were patterns, memories, energy condensed into form. And then I understood. The oceans had not been taken to destroy. They had been reclaimed to house these beings, their vast essence needing vessels far greater than stone. The seas themselves had been their prison, their cradle, their sanctuary. When they vanished, it was not erasure. It was migration. The vision tore itself from me, leaving me collapsed on the stone, coughing, shivering in the heat. My mind reeled with the revelation. If the oceans had been vessels for them, then what were we? Were our bodies, our lives, nothing more than containers to be emptied when the time came? Was our world just another shell, waiting to be cracked open so that something older, something greater, could inhabit it once again? I pressed my forehead to the ground, my body quaking. The hum returned, low and patient, pulsing with the rhythm of inevitability. For the first time I did not resist it. I let it move through me, filling my veins with its terrible cadence. And in that surrender I felt a flicker of understanding. We were not being destroyed. We were being rewritten. But the thought offered no comfort. To be rewritten was to cease to be. My eyes lifted to the fissure once more, and the glimmers within it seemed brighter, closer, as though it knew I was beginning to understand. The silence around me swelled, full of breathless expectation, and through it all the whisper returned, softer now, almost tender. You were never yours. The words shattered what little strength remained in me. I fell against the cracked stone, the phrase echoing in every chamber of my skull, echoing deeper than thought, deeper than language. You were never yours. The words clung to me, suffocating, stripping away even the illusion of autonomy. I had always believed that our lives, fragile as they were, still belonged to us. Yet now, standing in this emptied ocean, I saw the truth carved into the world itself. Nothing had ever been ours, not the land beneath our feet, not the water we drank, not even the beating of our hearts. I pressed my palms into the ground as if trying to steady myself against the weight of that knowledge. The earth vibrated in response, a subtle rhythm that reminded me of breathing. For a moment I wondered if the planet itself was alive. not as a metaphor, but as a truth we had refused to see. Perhaps all along we had been tenants, living on borrowed earth, blind to the fact that the owner had never left. The fissure glowed faintly, its light soft now, almost gentle, like an open eye no longer blinking but watching in patient silence. I turned my gaze toward it, unable to resist. The glimmers within shifted, moving with a grace that mocked the violence of their power. They were not in a hurry. They did not need to be. Time itself belonged to them, stretched wide as oceans and deep as stars. The pillar behind me cracked again, a harsh sound that tore the silence. Dust spilled down its sides, and from within came another shadowed form, writhing, stretching against its prison. Its shape grew sharper, closer to human now. Long arms, a torso, a head. But it was faceless, featureless, a hollow outline waiting to be filled. My skin crawled. Was this what awaited us? To be emptied and replaced, our bodies used as vessels as once the oceans had been. I stumbled backward, my chest burning with ragged breath. I wanted to flee, to tear myself from this geometry, but the seabed itself betrayed me. The glowing lines at my feet shifted, curving around me, tightening their hold. They herded me like currents, sweeping a swimmer toward the deep. I realised then that there was no escape, not because I lacked the will, but because the will was not mine to wield. I had always been inside the pattern. A sob broke from my throat, raw and pitiful. The sound felt alien in the vast silence, quickly swallowed, leaving no echo. I thought of my childhood, of the sound of waves striking the shore, of laughter carried on sea winds. The memory stabbed at me with unbearable grief. Had those moments belonged to me at all, or had they only been illusions granted by a design waiting to reclaim what was never mine? The fissure pulsed once more, brighter now, and the whisper returned, filling the silence like water flooding a chamber. Remember? The word rang through me, not cruel but insistent, as if it were less a command and more a gift, a chance to glimpse what had been taken before. My vision swam with light. I saw again the rivers beneath the world, vast and glowing, carrying not only oceans but fragments of lives, fragments of histories swallowed whole, the faces of children, the ruins of cities, the cries of forgotten songs, all dissolved into the currents, flowing endlessly into the unseen. The vision broke, and I gasped for breath, tears spilling down my face. The silence pressed close again, but now I understood its cruelty. It was not emptiness. It was fullness beyond comprehension, a silence so thick with memory that no sound could survive within it. I dropped to my knees once more, my body trembling, my mind unravelling under the weight of inevitability. You were never yours. The words rang again, softer now, almost tender, as though the fissure itself was soothing me, preparing me for what must come. I lifted my gaze to the raised hands carved into the circle. For the first time, I saw not only surrender, but relief in their gesture. To let go, to cease the struggle, to be returned to the design. Perhaps that was their final act of grace. And yet, even as the thoughts settled into me, something inside still resisted. A spark, faint and trembling, but alive. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to whisper through cracked lips. Then tell me, why me? The fissure flared, its glimmers swirling, and for the first time the silence answered. Because you will remember what the others forgot. The words left me trembling, for they carried not just inevitability but burden. The burden weighed heavier than the heat pressing down from the barren sky. To be chosen was one thing. To be chosen as a witness, a vessel of memory, was something far crueler. My legs buckled, my body struggling against the unseen gravity of those words. If all before me had been erased into silence, then why had I been set apart? Why must I remember when the others had been spared even that torment? The fissure glowed faintly, patient, as if waiting for me to grasp the full scope of my role. I looked toward the carved circle of raised hands, and for the first time I wondered if some of them had not been surrender at all, but testimony. Hands raised not in offering, but in warning. Perhaps that was what it meant to be burdened with memory, not to escape the cycle, but to ensure its terror was known. A gust of dry wind swept the basin, carrying with it no scent of salt, no trace of sea. It scraped dust across the etched lines of the ghostly city, briefly obscuring them before revealing the glow beneath. The designs pulsed brighter, forming pathways that all converged toward the fissure. My heart tightened. Every road led there. Every story ended there. The shadows within the pillar shifted again, sharper now, taking on the semblance of limbs, torsos, movements so painfully human that I had to look away. They pressed against the stone, silent, writhing, desperate. Were these the echoes of those who'd remembered before me? Did their burden twist them into something less than themselves? Shadows pacing the geometry forever? My throat burned at the thought. Perhaps this was the true punishment, not erasure, but remembrance without end. The hum grew stronger, wrapping around me like a current, impossible to resist. My chest ached as the vibration pressed against my heart. The word came again, steady and relentless. Return. But it was no longer aimed at all of humanity. I felt it pointed directly at me. I staggered forward, each step heavier than the last, until I stood once more at the edge of the fissure. The glimmers moved restlessly, like waves yearning to break free. I stared into them, trembling, my reflection fractured in their shifting light. And then I saw it, a shape within the glow, a mirror of myself. It was me, and yet not me. Its outline was blurred, its features unfinished, but its stance was unmistakable. It lifted its arms in the same gesture as the carved hands, raised upward, surrendering. My stomach lurched. The design was already rewriting me. My future self was waiting in the depths, hollow and obedient, already part of the cycle. "No," I whispered, my voice cracking. "Not me. Not yet." But even as the words left my lips, I knew they were futile. The fissure pulsed brighter, the reflection shimmering with inevitability. My shadow self raised its hands higher, glowing until its form dissolved into the currents of light. The silence deepened, pressing against my skull until I thought it would split. My knees hit the ground, dust billowing around me. I clutched at the cracks in the stone as though I could anchor myself to the world. But the world was shifting, folding, alive beneath me. My body trembled violently. Tears seared my eyes. I did not want to remember. I did not want to be chosen. But the choice was not mine. The fissure surged suddenly, light spilling upward in a violent wave, illuminating the seabed city in blinding brilliance. The pillar split open fully, shadows pouring out, fluid and endless, weaving themselves into the glowing lines. The ground roared beneath me, trembling with a force too vast to withstand. And then, in the midst of the chaos, I saw them, lights blooming in the emptiness above the seabed, like stars torn from the sky and dropped into the dust. They shimmered, flickering until they resolved into forms, not shadows, but lights in the shape of people, whole and bright. For a heartbeat I thought they were salvation, but then their voices rose, layered and endless, chanting the same word in unison: return. The sound drowned everything, pressing into my skull until my vision fractured. I covered my ears, screaming, but my own voice was lost within theirs. My body shook. My hands clutched at nothing. My breath came in ragged gasps. And then, as the lights closed in, the fissure erupted with a brilliance so fierce it blinded me. I could no longer see the seabed. I could no longer hear my own thoughts. There was only the word, vast and final, return. And in that brilliance, I felt the moment arrive when resistance would no longer matter. The thought wrapped itself around me like a shroud. My hands shook violently, pressed to the ground as though I could keep myself anchored. But the seabed itself was lifting, shifting, trembling with the force of that impossible light. Resistance, will, identity. All of it seemed to dissolve in the glare. The design had no need for my defiance. It had already written me into its pattern, and my struggle was nothing more than a ripple against an unbroken tide. I closed my eyes, but even then the brilliance pierced through, painting the insides of my eyelids with waves of gold and white. The hum had transformed into something vaster now, not a single tone but a chorus, infinite layers folding into each other, vibrating every bone in my body. It was music, but not for humans. It was an architecture of sound, a structure so immense it was both unbearable and perfect. My mind teetered on its edge, wanting to collapse into it, wanting to surrender just to make the pressure stop. Yet something still tethered me. It wasn't defiance this time, nor pride, but a small, stubborn thread of humanity. The memory of salt on my lips as a child when I tasted the sea spray, the laughter of voices carried across waves, the hush of tides at night when the world felt infinite. That memory kept me here, fragile though it was. If I had been chosen to remember, then perhaps memory itself was my weapon, the only shield left against the cycle. The brilliance dimmed suddenly as though it too had heard my thought. The fisher's light shrank back into itself, pulsing more gently as though measuring me. The glowing forms that had surrounded me retreated, their chant fading into silence. I lifted my head, trembling, sweat running in rivers down my face. The seabed still glowed with its impossible geometry. The pillar still radiated heat. The fisher still breathed light, but now it all seemed quieter, expectant. My chest rose and fell with jagged breaths. "Why me?" I whispered again, though my voice cracked with exhaustion. "Why burden me with this?" The silence pressed closer, and in it came a thought, not in words but in presence. Because you resist. The revelation cut deeper than any command, because I resist. Because where others surrendered, I clung to memory, to identity, to the fragile illusion of choice. The cycle did not need more silence. It needed someone to carry the echo of what had been. The burden was not a curse alone. It was a function. I was not outside the pattern. I was part of it, necessary to its continuation. The realization chilled me to the bone. If I was meant to remember, then even my defiance was scripted, written into the geometry like every step before it. I was not breaking the cycle. I was completing it. I stumbled to my feet, the air thick and dry, my limbs heavy, a stone. The fisher's glow dimmed further, but its pull was stronger than ever. I felt it not in my body, but in my soul, a gravitational force dragging me inward. The raised hands carved into the circle glowed faintly now, softer than before, and for a moment I imagined them not as symbols of surrender, but of farewell. I closed my eyes, and for a breathless instant I thought I heard the ocean again. Not the phantom rush of unseen waves, but the real ocean, alive, endless. The voice of the earth before it had been drained away. It filled me with grief so raw I nearly collapsed again. To remember was agony, sharper than any erasure. The fisher pulsed once more, brighter, demanding. My eyes snapped open to see the shadow within the pillar stretch free at last, spilling into the seabed. It did not move like a creature, but like water, flowing into the lines carved across the ground, filling them, animating them, until the entire city glowed alive. I watched in horror and awe as the etched streets pulsed like veins, the geometry shifting around me, forming patterns that moved even as they remained etched in stone. It was alive, vast and breathing, and I stood within its body. And then, in that living light, I saw shapes rising. Not shadows this time, but luminous outlines, human in form but hollow, waiting to be filled. They gathered in silence, faceless, patient, forming a circle around me. I could not breathe. I knew what they were. They were vessels, and they were waiting for us. The realization struck harder than any command, harder than any vision. The luminous outlines surrounding me were not guardians nor witnesses. They were containers, hollow forms shaped like us, built to hold what we once thought untouchable, our very being. They did not move, did not speak, yet their stillness was heavier than thunder. They were patient, impossibly patient, as if they had been waiting through ages for the right moment to be filled. My throat tightened as I stared at them, my chest aching with breath I could not release. They stood in a perfect circle, luminous and pale, casting faint shadows against the etched lines of the seabed. No eyes, no mouths, no features, only outlines shimmering with emptiness. Yet I felt them watching me, not with sight but with expectation, as though every fibre of their hollow frames strained toward me. A sick thought churned in my mind. Perhaps this was why the oceans had vanished first. Perhaps their disappearance had not been punishment but preparation. The seas had been drained to clear the stage, to empty the vessel of the world itself so new forms could be made ready. And now the vessel stood waiting, faceless and open, hungry for what we were. The fissure pulsed again, and the hum returned deeper than ever, shaking the brittle seabed until dust cascaded down the cracks. The word pressed into me once more, thunderous and undeniable: return. I stumbled backward, my boots scraping against the etched lines, but the vessels did not move. They only glowed brighter, their forms shimmering as though stirred by invisible tides. My knees weakened under the weight of their silence. This was no threat. This was inevitability. The pillar groaned behind me, its fractured core bleeding more light into the air. The shadows that had writhed inside it now stretched outward, weaving among the vessels like ink dissolving in water. Where the shadows touched, the hollow outlines shimmered violently, trembling as though awakening. My stomach lurched. The vessels were not simply waiting, they were being prepared. My breath came ragged, shallow. I tried to speak, to beg, to deny, to curse, but my voice caught in my throat. All I could hear was the hum filling every crack of silence, binding me to this place. My mind burned with memories, the sound of waves on rock, the laughter of friends on shores, the smell of salt. They came unbidden, desperate, as though my own body clung to them before they could be stolen. A sudden flash seared my vision. My knees gave way and I collapsed onto the glowing lines. My palms pressed to the stone, and instantly the hum surged, fusing with my heartbeat until I could no longer tell which was which. My body shook with a rhythm that was not mine. I lifted my head, and in the light I saw it, one of the vessels shifting. It leaned forward, not walking, not moving, but bending toward me like water poured into a mould. Its faceless surface rippled, and in that rippling I saw fragments of myself, my eyes, my hands, my mouth, flickering across its hollow frame before dissolving. The vessel was learning me, pulling me apart piece by piece, shaping itself in my image. No! The word tore from my throat, raw and useless, but it broke the silence for a moment. The vessels froze, their glow dimming as though startled. My heart hammered, and I forced myself to my feet, swaying, defiance burning in my chest. I am not yours. I am not a vessel. The fissure pulsed violently at my words, a surge of blinding light exploding upward, nearly knocking me from my feet. The hum roared, shaking my bones, filling my skull with fire. My vision fractured again, flooded with images not my own. Oceans folding into darkness, cities dissolving into currents of light, faces erased into hollow echoes. Every image screamed the same truth. You were never yours. I staggered, clutching my temples, tears burning down my cheeks. The vessels began to glow again, brighter than before, their emptiness now radiant, undeniable. My words had not stopped them. My defiance had only confirmed what they already knew. I was next. And yet, beneath the roar, beneath the visions, beneath the crushing inevitability, a whisper stirred. Faint, fragile, but mine. If I am meant to remember, then I will remember everything, even this. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stand. My body trembled, my vision swam, but I fixed my gaze on the faceless vessels. They waited still, patient, endless. The fissure pulsed again, brighter, angrier, demanding, and in that unbearable silence, I realised the vessels were not only waiting for us, they were waiting for me. The thought lodged itself like a blade, sharp and undeniable. I had always assumed I was just a witness, dragged here by chance or fate, but the circle of faceless forms made it clear. This was not observation. This was selection. They had not been waiting for humanity in some abstract, distant sense. They had been waiting for me, as though my arrival was the final movement in a symphony composed long before I existed. The vessels glowed brighter, their outlines rippling with light that flickered like water. They leaned imperceptibly closer, though their feet never moved. My skin prickled with the sensation of being pulled apart, drawn toward them by a gravity deeper than physical force. My breath came shallow, my chest tight, as if the very air around me had grown thick with expectation. The fissure pulsed again, and the hum swelled until my ribs rattled with its vibration. The word thundered through me, the same word I had heard countless times before, but now it carried the weight of inevitability pressed against my bones. Return. I shook my head violently, gasping, clawing at the air. No, I whispered, though the word felt powerless, drowned beneath the chorus of silence. The fissure's light flared, answering with indifference. Defiance was noise, pattern was law. My eyes darted across the seabed, searching desperately for escape. The etched streets glowed like veins, all converging toward the circle where I stood. Every road led here, as if the city itself had been designed for this moment. There was no path outward. The only path was down. The vessels rippled again, and one of them shifted forward, not a step, not a movement, but a slide, as though it were water spilling into shape. Its faceless frame trembled with light, and once more I saw myself flicker across its hollow surface, my eyes, my mouth, my stance. The vessel was becoming me, anticipating me, readying itself to receive. My stomach twisted, bile rising in my throat. Was this how it had always been? Every person, every soul folded into vessels that mirrored them, their identities preserved only as hollow outlines. Was memory the only fragment allowed to remain? I staggered back, but the circle tightened around me, the glow of the vessels intensifying. The pillar behind me groaned, its cracks splitting wider, spilling light like blood from a wound. The shadows writhed furiously now, pouring into the lines etched across the ground, igniting the entire city in motion. I was no longer standing in ruins. I was standing inside a living mechanism awakening for me. The hum deepened further, and with it came a voice distinct from the chorus, colder, sharper, intimate. It did not command. It stated, "You are the threshold." The words froze. Me in place. Threshold. Not witness. Not vessel. Threshold. My mind reeled. Did this mean I was the crossing point, the passage between what had been and what would come next? The fissure pulsed violently, answering with its blinding glow. and in that light I saw the truth written across the seabed. Every line, every spiral, every hand raised to the sky had been leading here. To me, my body trembled under the crushing enormity of it. To be a threshold was not privilege, it was annihilation. It meant to be opened, torn apart so that what waited could pass through. The vessels drew closer still, faceless, radiant, their outlines trembling as though barely able to contain their hunger. My reflection shimmered across them again, flickering and unstable. For the first time I understood what had been taken before the oceans. It had not been seas or worlds or even civilizations. It had been thresholds, chosen again and again, used and discarded to keep the cycle turning, and now I was next. My knees buckled, and I fell into the circle, my palms pressed against the glowing stone. The hum surged, rising into a deafening roar, the vessels vibrating with light so intense it burned my skin. The fissure erupted in brilliance, the city's lines blazing alive. My vision fractured, drowning in light, my body collapsing under forces I could not resist. And in that flood of radiance, one final thought rose above the roar. Maybe being chosen was not about survival, but about becoming the passage through which survival itself was ensured. The words turned my veins to ice. A passage. Not an individual, not a life with its own meaning, but a threshold, an opening, a door through which something older, vaster could step. My resistance, my memories, my pain, all of it meant nothing if my purpose was only to be opened and emptied. Yet the radiance pressed into me, wrapping my body in its impossible heat, pulling my bones apart with currents of light as if they were driftwood caught in a tide. I screamed, or thought I did, but the sound never escaped my throat. The roar of the fissure swallowed everything, flooding me with images that burned across my vision. Oceans vanishing in silence, cities dissolving into dust, stars themselves flickering out, their light drained into unseen channels. I saw worlds like ours, entire civilizations carried through thresholds like me, one after another, as if the universe itself was a series of chambers meant to be emptied and refilled. The vessels leaned closer. Their faceless outlines rippled with fragments of my own reflection, flickering like broken mirrors. My hands trembled as I pressed them to the stone, feeling its glow crawl into me, filling me with unbearable pressure. My mind screamed in terror, but beneath it all something colder stirred. Acceptance. Not because I wanted it, but because the design was too vast, too ancient, too inevitable to fight. Still, the small ember of defiance inside me refused to die. If I am the threshold, then I will decide what passes through. The thought was reckless, absurd, and yet it clung to me with desperate strength. Perhaps I could not stop the mechanism, but maybe I could shape its outcome. Perhaps memory was not just a burden. Perhaps it was leverage. The fissure pulsed violently as if it had heard me. Its glimmers twisted into patterns, no longer formless currents, but deliberate spirals, mirrors of the etchings beneath me. For a moment the roar faded, and I thought I heard voices layered and endless, speaking not the word I'd heard so many times before, but something new. Show us. The command sent a shiver through me. Show us. My mind reeled with possibilities. Did they want me to surrender my memories? To feed the vessels with all I had lived? Was that the purpose of choosing me? Not to preserve myself, but to give everything I carried into the design. My breath caught at the thought. If I let go, the vessels would not only take me, but everyone I had ever known. Every voice, every face, every fleeting joy would be poured into them and lost forever. No, I whispered, shaking. My voice trembled, but the word was mine. You will not take them from me. They are mine. The vessels flickered violently, their glow wavering as though my refusal had struck them. The fissure flared in anger, light searing up into the sky, the hum rising into a roar that shook the seabed like thunder. My body convulsed under its force, my skin burning, my veins alight with fire. But I clung to that thought, that single fragile defiance, with everything I had left. The roar pressed harder, but the images that poured into me changed. No longer oceans folding into darkness, no longer faceless shadows pacing endless circuits. Instead I saw children laughing on shores, lovers holding hands beneath sunsets, the smell of rain after a storm, my mother's voice, my father's silence, my own first memory of standing in the waves as a child, the sea rising around my legs, endless and alive. These images seared brighter than the fisher's light, brighter than the vessel's glow, and for the first time I realised the truth. Memory was not just burden, it was resistance, it was identity. And perhaps that was why they had chosen me, because memory had the power to break even the silence. The fisher shuddered violently, its light fracturing into jagged streams that raced across the seabed, splitting into 1,000 directions. The vessels shook, their outlines trembling, their faceless frames quivering as if they could not hold their form. And then the hum faltered. For a heartbeat, the silence returned. Not the suffocating silence of design, but the silence of doubt. I stood trembling, my chest heaving, my body half broken, but I knew what I had done. I had cracked the pattern, and in that fragile silence, one question burned hotter than any light. If the cycle could be broken, what would take its place? The thought rang through me, louder than the fisher's hum, sharper than the vessel's glow. The cycle had felt eternal, an unbreakable rhythm written into the bones of the earth. But now, in this fragile pause, I saw cracks forming in its perfection. Doubt had seeped into its silence, and doubt, once born, could spread like fire. If the mechanism faltered, even for a breath, then the possibility of another path opened. But what was that path? What could exist outside a cycle so ancient it predated the oceans themselves? The fisher pulsed faintly, its light dimmer now, flickering like a wounded flame. The vessel stood trembling, their faceless forms unstable, as though they no longer knew what they were meant to hold. Their silence felt less like inevitability, and more like confusion, like hesitation. My chest heaved with ragged breath as I realised I had not destroyed them, I had unsettled them. But the danger of that realisation cut both ways. If the cycle broke, would it bring freedom or collapse? The oceans had been moved with precision, carried to a place beyond my comprehension. But if the mechanism fractured, would the seas return, or would everything shatter into chaos? The fisher brightened suddenly, as though answering my thought. My vision blurred with another surge of imagery. Cities crumbling, stars flickering out, entire worlds collapsing into silence. Not a cycle, but chaos. I gasped, clutching my temples, the pain unbearable. The vision wanted to remind me of one truth. Cycles may be cruel, but they preserved. Without them, only destruction remained. But even as the vision consumed me, I felt another thought rising stubbornly from deep within. Preservation at the cost of self was not survival. It was slavery. If the price of the cycle was erasure, then perhaps chaos was the only true freedom. The fisher trembled in fury, its light flaring, and the vessels leaned forward again, their outlines tightening as though trying to reclaim what had slipped. The hum surged, desperate now, pressing against my bones with suffocating force. The word thundered again, relentless. Return. I staggered but did not fall. My body shook violently, but my voice rose, cracked and broken. No! The vessel shuddered at the word, their glow dimming once more. The fisher flared in fury, but the hum faltered for a heartbeat, uncertain. The silence that followed was different this time. Not patient, not inevitable, but strained, like a cord pulled too tight. I lifted my head, tears burning down my face, my chest raw with the weight of defiance. If I am the threshold, I whispered, then I choose what crosses. The fissure roared, its light exploding upward, nearly blinding me. The vessels pulsed violently, flickering as though torn between existence and collapse. My body convulsed under the pressure, every nerve on fire, but my mind clung to the memory of what I had seen. Not visions of erasure, not cycles of surrender, but human moments. Laughter, grief, voices carried on waves. They were fragile, but they were real. And they were mine. The fissure's roar faltered again, light stuttering like a dying star. The vessels wavered, their outlines collapsing inward, their faceless frames twisting into smoke. They trembled as though unsure whether to persist or dissolve. I watched in awe and horror as the perfect symmetry of the design unravelled before my eyes. The silence that followed was unbearable. The hum was gone. The vessels were gone. The fissure pulsed weakly, its light unstable, fractured. I stood in the circle of raised hands, alone, trembling, my chest heaving, my body broken but still my own. And yet the silence did not feel like victory. It felt like a pause before something vast and unknowable. The cycle had cracked, but what would rise in its place was beyond me. A faint tremor ran through the seabed, gentle but insistent, like the first stirrings of a tide. My breath caught. The oceans, could they return? Or had I broken the very vessel that held them? I fell to my knees, clutching the stone, my tears spilling freely. The world felt unbearably fragile now, balanced on the edge of collapse or renewal, and in that stillness, one final whisper rose from the fissure, faint but unmistakable. Now you decide. My breath froze. The choice was mine. The words echoed inside me louder than the hum had ever been, though no sound filled the ruined city. The fissure's glow dimmed and brightened in uneven pulses, as if waiting for my decision. The silence pressed in around me, heavy and endless. And for the first time I understood what it meant to hold the weight of a world in my hands. I was no longer a witness, no longer merely a vessel to be. I was a hinge, a turning point, the place where countless cycles might fracture or continue. But what choice did I truly have? My body trembled, broken by light and sound, my mind scarred by visions I could not forget. Every path I imagined seemed laced with destruction. If I surrendered, the vessels would return, the cycle would resume, and humanity, all life, would be folded into silence again. If I refused, the fissure might collapse entirely, tearing everything apart, not only here but in every place the cycle touched. I pressed my palm to the glowing stone, feeling its warmth seep into my skin. It thrummed faintly now, not with command, but with patience, as if offering me time. My breath came slow, uneven. My memories surged in fragments, the oceans alive with foam and storm, the comfort of voices carried across water, the fragile tenderness of love and loss. They were small things compared to the vast machinery I'd seen, yet they felt more real, more enduring than any cycle. The fissure pulsed again, and another whisper stirred inside me, fragile and uncertain. Restore. Restore. My heart lurched. Could I bring the oceans back? Could I return what had been stolen? The thought cut through me like a blade of hope, sharp and dangerous. But the whisper carried no instructions, no certainty, only a possibility. To restore might mean salvation, but it could also mean unleashing chaos, drowning a world unprepared to hold its seas again. I clenched my fists, staring at the fissure's glow. If I choose, I whispered, my voice raw, then I will choose for them. For us. My words trembled in the still air, fragile but defiant. I could not allow erasure to be the only destiny. If restoration meant risk, then so be it. Life was always risk. The fissure brightened at my words, its glow sharp and blinding. The seabed trembled beneath me, cracks racing outward like veins of light. The etched streets pulsed alive once more, but this time the hum was gone. Instead, there was rhythm, a steady beat, like a heartbeat echoing through the stone. My chest rose and fell in time with it, as if the city itself breathed again. The vessels had vanished, but in their place, faint outlines shimmered at the edges of the light. Not hollow frames, not faceless shells, but shadows of what had been. I saw fleeting glimpses of people walking, voices whispering, lives unfolding. They flickered like candle flames in the wind, fragile but unmistakable. Memory had not only resisted, it had carved its own space into the silence. The fisher's light flared violently, rushing upward like a torrent, splitting the sky above the dead seabed. For an instant I swore I heard the rush of water, faint, distant, but real. My heart clenched. The oceans were not gone. They had only been held, suspended beyond reach. If I chose, they could return. The stone beneath my knees glowed hotter, the heat searing through my skin. My body shook with the force of it, but I pressed my palms deeper into the etched lines, offering everything I had left. "Restore!" I shouted, my voice breaking, raw and desperate. The fisher answered. Its brilliance erupted into the sky, flooding everything with light so pure it stripped the seabed of shadow. The ground shook violently, splitting open as torrents of energy surged outward, racing along the etched streets, spilling into every fracture, every scar. My body convulsed with the force, and my vision drowned in radiance. And then I heard it. The roar I had begged for, the voice I thought lost forever. Water. A torrent, endless and alive, rushing back into the world with the fury of return. My chest heaved, tears streaming down my face as the sound grew, overwhelming, unstoppable. The oceans were coming back. But as the roar filled the silence, another thought carved itself into my mind, darker and heavier than hope. What else would return with them? The sound of rushing water swelled until it was all I could hear. A flood pouring through the fractures of the seabed and surging into the hollow sky above. My body trembled beneath the magnitude of it, my skin vibrating with the sheer force of returning oceans. And yet beneath the awe, beneath the tears burning hot down my face, the question gnawed like a worm inside my chest. The oceans had not been taken alone. They had been dragged into silence with purpose, bound to the cycle. If I had torn open the threshold, then what I restored would not be clean. It would be everything. The fisher's glow flared wildly, and the city beneath me cracked apart. Pillars crumbled as torrents of liquid light surged upward, twisting in great spirals before transforming into waves. Real waves, salt and foam, water alive with weight and movement, bursting into existence where none had been. For a moment it felt like salvation, the world's heartbeat returning. But then the shadows came. At first they appeared as smudges within the waves, indistinct and fleeting. Then, with each pulse of the fisher, they grew sharper, tall, formless figures rising out of the foam, faceless as the vessels, yet fluid, darker than night. They did not stand upon the waves. They were the waves, twisting in and out of the water, shaping it with their movements. Their silence pressed against me once more, familiar and suffocating, but now sharpened with hunger. My breath caught. These were not vessels. They were what the vessels had been made to contain. The ocean was their prison, the endless tides their cage, and I had broken the lock. The fisher roared again, its light spilling upward, but the shadows only multiplied. They stretched across the water, spilling into the air like smoke that refused to dissipate. They had no voices, no faces, only a presence that pressed into my skull until my thoughts scattered into fragments. They were not beings in the way I understood. They were currents. They were hunger given form. I staggered to my feet, clinging to the trembling stone. My chest heaved as I forced the words out. No, I didn't free you. I restored the oceans, that was all. But even as I said it, I knew it was a lie. The oceans had never been just water. They had always been a boundary, a moving prison designed to keep something vast and unspeakable contained. The figures swayed in unison, their bodies rippling with the rhythm of tides. The silence they carried was different from before, not the calm inevitability of the vessels, but the wild emptiness of a hunger never satisfied. And then, through the roar of water, I felt it again. A word, not spoken but pressed against my bones. Return. Not the return of oceans, the return of them. My stomach twisted violently, dread swallowing what little triumph I'd felt. Had my defiance saved us, or had it opened the gates for something far worse than silence? The fissure dimmed, its light weakening as if drained by what had escaped. The heartbeat I had felt in the stone faltered. The city groaned as fractures widened, whole blocks collapsing into the rising tide. Water surged outward, reclaiming the seabed with terrifying speed, and in the waves the shadows multiplied, spreading across the horizon like a stain. Panic tore through me, but beneath it came clarity sharper than fear. This was the third truth. The cycle had never been about preservation for its own sake. It had been containment. The vessels, the silence, the erasure, all of it had been the price paid to keep these things locked away. I had broken the lock. The roar of the ocean swelled higher, drowning the world, but the word did not fade. Return. Louder now, insistent, demanding. My knees buckled under its weight, my body shaking violently. I pressed my hands to my skull, desperate to hold on to myself, to memory, to defiance. But the silence of their hunger seeped deeper, threatening to strip me clean. The water rose around me, soaking the ruins, pulling at my legs with relentless strength. The shadows writhed within it, countless, formless, endless. And as I gasped for air, one final thought seared through my mind. Perhaps survival had never been the question. Perhaps the only true question was whether humanity could endure what returned with the oceans. The water climbed higher, dragging ruins and bone alike into its swelling body. My lungs ached with the salt-thick air, my skin raw from the fisher's glare. The shadows surged within the tide, growing bolder, no longer content to flicker like stains. Now they rose in towers, liquid spires that bent and broke like waves caught in eternal motion. They didn't move toward me directly. They had no need. Their silence reached me before their forms ever could. It pressed into my chest like a weight, crushing thought into fragments, scattering reason like driftwood. The fisher's light weakened further, no longer a source of order but a ragged wound spilling its last radiance. My body swayed with the pull of the water, half submerged, every muscle trembling from exhaustion. And still the word echoed, return. A command not just for the oceans, not just for the shadows, but for something far older. Return, as though the world itself was being called back into a state it had once known, a shape it had once carried before memory. My heart hammered. What if these shadows were not intruders, not parasites, but the ocean's true inhabitants? What if the seas had never belonged to us, but to them, and humanity had been nothing more than an interruption? The thought sank into me like lead. I remembered standing on shorelines as a child, staring into the depths, feeling awe and fear mixed together in equal measure. We had always sensed it, hadn't we? That the water was alive with something vast and unseen. Legends of leviathans, gods of the deep, voices calling sailors into the waves. Perhaps those were not stories born of imagination. Perhaps they were fragments of memory, of what once ruled. The fissure pulsed one last time, a dim and desperate flicker, and I felt it beg me with a whisper so faint it could barely rise above. The roar of water. Choose. The demand ripped through me. Choose. Between the return of the seas and the return of their hunger. Between silence and chaos. Between erasure and annihilation. My throat burned with a scream I could not release. How could a single choice bear the weight of a world? The shadows swelled, filling the horizon, writhing across the surface of the ocean like veins of living darkness. I felt them pressing into me, not with words, but with need, endless and gnawing. They did not hate. They did not rage. They consumed. That was their truth, their design. And yet, beneath the horror, something deeper stirred in me. Awe. But they were not monsters in the way I had been taught to fear monsters. They were life in its rawest form, stripped of morality, stripped of memory, older than our frail species could ever imagine. They had endured before us. They would endure after. Was endurance itself not a kind of truth? The fissure cracked wider, releasing a final surge of light that tore into the waves. For a moment the shadows recoiled, hissing back into the foam, but the fissure's glow faltered immediately, dimming into weakness. It could not hold them long. It could not decide for me. The water swirled higher, dragging me from my knees. My body floated helplessly, caught between collapse and surrender. My mind spun with the weight of choice. To resist meant risking erasure. To release meant unleashing hunger. But what if there was a third path, one not written in the cycle's design? Clutching the stone edge, my nails torn bloody, I forced breath into my lungs and whispered hoarsely, "If survival is not the question, then what is?" The shadows froze. The ocean's roar faltered. The silence deepened, pressing heavier than ever before. For the first time I felt them listening. A tremor coursed through my body, through the ruins, through the water itself. The fissure quivered like a dying heart, waiting for an answer I did not yet have. And in that stillness I understood. The decision was no longer about oceans or shadows, about humanity or silence. It was about meaning, what deserved to endure. And in that realization I felt the air leave my chest, my body sinking deeper into the rising tide. The water swallowed me, heavy and cold, pulling me into its infinite weight. My lungs screamed, but I did not thrash. I let the descent take me, as though some part of me knew the fight could not be waged on the surface. Light from the fissure bled faintly through the dark water above, dimming as I fell further into the abyss. Around me the shadows coiled, no longer distant figures but endless forms, streaming like ribbons of ink through the water, curling closer with every pulse. Their silence pressed tighter, but beneath the suffocating void I felt something else, an invitation. They were not only hunger, they were asking in their formless way whether I could carry them, whether I would become the vessel that the cycle had always demanded. My chest burned with the need for air, my vision clouding, and in the flicker between life and drowning, I almost surrendered. But then another memory rose, fierce and piercing. I saw the coastline of my childhood, the laughter of voices echoing across water, the spray of salt on sun-warmed skin. The ocean had always been more than a prison. It had been a cradle too, carrying, nourishing, sustaining. It belonged not only to them, but to all of us who had lived by it, sung to it, wept into it. That truth seared through me like a final breath. I kicked against the weight of the tide, arms straining, legs burning. The shadows recoiled at the defiance, their silence crackling into a hiss that wasn't sound but pressure in my skull. I reached upward, toward the thinning glow above. My body screamed for air, every nerve alight with agony, but my will held. And then something shifted. The fisher's glow surged brighter, streaking down through the water in threads of light that tangled with the shadows. They writhed against it, their forms fracturing, twisting in fury. The light did not erase them, but it reshaped them, pulling them into patterns, whirls, spirals, currents. For the first time, the shadows lost their chaos. They were bound, not by silence, but by rhythm. I broke the surface with a ragged gasp, dragging in air so sharp it sliced my throat. Waves crashed around me, heavy and alive, but I no longer feared them. The fisher blazed at the horizon, a torn wound spilling its last strength, and the city beneath the waves glimmered faintly before vanishing into the depths. The choice was still mine, but it no longer felt like a binary. Silence or chaos had never been the only paths. There was rhythm, there was balance. The shadows churned within the waves, restless but no longer aimless. They bent with the tides, curling into shapes that seemed almost like listening. They pressed against me, not with hunger, but with demand. They would not vanish, they would endure. But perhaps they could be taught to endure differently. The fisher's last whisper slid into me, thin as the crack of a dying flame. Not vessel, voice. My breath caught. Voice, not to contain them, not to erase them, but to speak, to weave, to hold rhythm where silence and chaos had warred. Could that be the path beyond the cycle? Could humanity exist not as prisoners or prey, but as a chorus? Fragile, yes, but present, part of the rhythm. The ocean rose higher, cresting into waves that towered over the drowned city. The shadows writhed within them, their silence threatening to suffocate once more. But I closed my eyes and exhaled, not words but a sound. Broken, hoarse, yet mine. A sound against silence, a thread against the weight. The waves shuddered, the shadows rippled, and for a heartbeat, impossibly, the ocean stilled around me. My body shook with exhaustion, my chest burning, my voice nearly gone. But I understood then. Survival would not be about resisting them or releasing them. It would be about singing into the water, holding rhythm against the void, daring to let memory become sound. The fisher dimmed completely, the wound closing, leaving only the ocean's roar. And in that roar, threaded faintly, I heard an answer. Not human, not shadow, but something between. And with it came a final, terrifying clarity. If I had become voice, then I would have to speak for all of us. The ocean pressed against me, vast and listening, as though every drop waited for the sound I would release. My throat burned raw, my chest ached, yet I could not remain silent. To speak now was not just survival, it was defiance, a refusal to be folded into the cycle, a demand that humanity's memory endure. I inhaled salt-heavy air and let my voice tear itself free, broken and trembling, but carrying a rhythm I had known since birth, the pulse of a heart, the breath between waves, the fragile cadence of being alive. The water shivered around me. The shadows froze mid-current, their formless bodies bending in unnatural stillness. For a heartbeat, the ocean held itself in suspension, as though straining to hear, and then the silence pressed harder, a crushing demand to stop, to surrender. My body convulsed, but I forced another sound. Longer this time, rawer, carrying not words but memory. The laughter of loved ones, the grief of loss, the fragile warmth of belonging. The silence cracked, not shattered, not destroyed, but fissured, as though the endless weight could not fully contain what I had released. The shadows writhed violently, their hunger pressing against me with suffocating force, but I felt something shift beneath the crushing tide. They were no longer pressing to erase me. They were bending, faltering, struggling against the rhythm I poured into the water. My voice broke again, but I clung to it. Each sound was agony, a tearing of my throat, yet each thread of rhythm carved deeper into the silence. The shadows swarmed closer, surrounding me until the ocean became nothing but a whirl of blackened foam, their forms stretching high above the waves. They loomed like titans, faceless, endless, and for a moment terror almost silenced me. But then I remembered. I was not alone. I carried the voices of all who had ever sung to the sea, who had prayed to it, cursed it, depended on it. Every song of fishermen, every cry of sailors, every whisper of lovers by the shore. Their fragments lived in me, in all of us. And if I was voice, then I was not only mine. I opened my mouth and let them through. Not words, chorus. The rhythm expanded beyond me, spreading through the water in vibrations too vast to be just my own. The shadows recoiled, their silence trembling, their hunger twisting upon itself. For the first time, I sensed fear in them. Not fear of me, but of rhythm, of voice, of something they could not consume because it was not flesh or bone, but meaning. The ocean rose higher, towering waves crashing outward, but their force no longer felt aimless. The shadows bent with them, drawn into spirals, their forms weaving into the tides like ink pulled into patterns. They were not gone. They would never be gone. But they were no longer free to devour without shape. They were tethered, bound not by silence but by rhythm. My body trembled, nearly broken, yet I understood. This was endurance. This was how humanity might exist in a world that had never truly belonged to us. Not through dominion, not through resistance, but through voice. To sing into the water, endlessly, against the silence. To refuse to vanish. The fissure behind me had dimmed to nothing, its wound closed, its light gone. The choice was no longer supported by its power. It was mine alone, fragile and fleeting. The ocean thundered, the shadows writhed, and my voice faltered to a whisper, yet the rhythm still pulsed outward, carving a fragile path in the dark. The sea had returned, the shadows had returned, but so had we, and as the waves closed over me once more, I felt the world trembling on the edge of its next beginning. The water folded me inward, dragging me deeper into its dark cradle. But the tremor I felt was not only within my body, it was within the ocean itself. A vast shudder rippled outward through currents, a resonance that echoed across the deep as though something immense had stirred awake. The silence did not vanish, but it fractured, replaced by the heavy rhythm I had forced into being. I was no longer sinking alone. The sea was sinking with me. My lungs ached, my vision blurred, yet the ocean seemed to hold me gently now, less a predator and more a weight of listening. The shadows no longer pressed with pure hunger. Instead they circled, their formless bodies threading around me in spirals, hesitant, as though unsure whether to devour or to follow. They pulsed with tension, their silence testing my rhythm, but it no longer drowned me outright. It bent to the edges of my breath. In that moment, I understood that this was not victory. It was not salvation. It was negotiation. This cycle had not been broken, but it had been interrupted, reshaped, delayed. Humanity would not escape the ocean's claim, but it might carve out a fragile space within it. Not dominance, never that, but coexistence. A razor-thin balance at the edge of being. I thought of those who had come after me, standing at shores that now lay beneath these rising tides. Would they hear echoes of what I'd released? Would they sense the rhythm in the waves, the faint song pulsing beneath the silence? Or would the shadows grow bolder, pressing until memory bent back toward hunger? My voice would not last forever. No single voice could. But perhaps voices could be carried forward, as they had always been, one thread binding to the next, an unbroken chain of sound against oblivion. The water brightened faintly ahead, a shimmer. That was not the fish's dying glow, but the glint of sunlight breaking through the surface. My body strained upward, lungs close to collapse, and I forced my limbs to move, dragging myself toward it. The shadows swirled tightly, pressing closer, testing me once more. Their silence hissed like static in my ears, urging surrender. My body nearly obeyed, but then I exhaled one last thread of rhythm, weak but unbroken, and the shadows bent away, circling but not consuming. I broke the surface with a ragged scream, air tearing into me like fire. The sea roared around me, immense and wild, but its roar now carried undercurrents of rhythm, faint but unmistakable. The shadows writhed within it, endless and watchful, yet they did not strike. They listened, they waited. The horizon stretched out, a world drowned anew, coastlines erased, cities swallowed. Humanity's place would be changed forever. But the rhythm still pulsed, however faintly, and I understood it was not mine alone anymore. The ocean had carried it outward, scattering it across its endless body, into every current, every wave. I floated there, weak and trembling, but inside me rose something I had not felt since the waters began to vanish. Hope. Fragile, uncertain, trembling like the rhythm itself, but hope nonetheless. The oceans had returned, but not unchanged. The shadows had endured, but not unchallenged. The silence still lingered, but it now had a voice threaded through it. Perhaps that was enough, or perhaps it was only the beginning of a darker reckoning yet to come. The thought hung inside me like a stone, heavy and inescapable, even as the ocean rocked me gently on its surface. The waves no longer felt entirely hostile, yet beneath their rolling crests I could sense the shadows' endless restlessness. They had not been defeated. They had only been bound, reshaped into rhythm, held at bay by a fragile thread of voice. But silence has patience. It waits. It gnaws. And as I drifted beneath the pale sunlight, I wondered how long before it surged again, heavier, hungrier, unstoppable. The sea stretched endlessly, the horizon dissolving into mist. No land greeted my eyes. What remained of the world was water, sky, and the uneasy companionship of the shadows that still circled far below. Their presence was unmistakable, like a weight pressing from beneath, a reminder that my defiance had not erased them. It had only delayed the reckoning. I let my body drift, exhaustion pulling at every muscle, but my mind churned with questions. If I was voice, if I was rhythm, then what did that truly mean? Could one voice, even carried by the ocean, truly hold the silence at bay for long? Or had I merely bought us time, a breath before the cycle consumed us again? The ocean is endless, but humanity is not. We are fragile. We forget. We fall silent too easily. A memory came then, unexpected and sharp. My grandmother's lullaby, sung in the hush of night when I was small, her voice trembling but sure. I hadn't thought of it in years, yet now it threaded itself through me, clear as the pulse of my own blood. A rhythm passed down, not erased by time. Perhaps that was the answer. Not one voice, but many. Not me alone, but all of us, if we could remember to keep singing. The shadows stirred beneath me, sensing the thought. Their silence pressed hard, a suffocating reminder of their dominance. But I whispered the lullaby into the wind. My voice cracked, weak, nearly lost in the ocean's roar, yet I felt the waters shiver with it. The silence buckled briefly and the shadows faltered. Even this broken fragment was enough to unsettle them. Hope flickered again, but it was edged with fear. Because if rhythm was the weapon, then silence would always seek to unmake it. The shadows would not forget my defiance. They would wait, and they would return with fury. And if humanity faltered, If we fell quiet again, the silence would claim us all. The ocean rocked harder, waves growing taller, the sky darkening with rolling clouds. Lightning forked in the distance, thunder chasing close behind. The storm felt less like weather and more like the ocean's own breath, testing, warning. My voice felt small beneath its roar, yet I forced myself to speak again, to let sound thread outward into the wind and rain. The storm listened. It didn't break, not yet, but I sensed it curve slightly with my rhythm, as though even fury could be bent, however briefly. That was the truth then. Not control, not conquest, but shaping. Bending silence into rhythm, bending chaos into pattern. It would never be easy. It would never be permanent, but it could be done. The thunder rolled again, louder this time, and the rain began to fall in sheets, each drop like a drum beat. The ocean roared, the shadows writhed, and I let my voice join them, raw, small, but steady. The storm swallowed me whole, but within it I felt no erasure, only struggle, only endurance. And as the waves rose higher, swallowing the horizon, I knew the reckoning had not been postponed forever. It had already begun. The storm was not just weather, it was the ocean itself pulling its strength together, a vast convulsion of fury and hunger. Every wave seemed to carry both rhythm and silence, colliding in a clash that shook me to my core. My body was thrown between them, tossed as though I were nothing more than driftwood, yet my voice still clung weakly to the air. I shouted, not to be heard by ears, but to be felt by the water itself. The rhythm had to continue, even if broken, even if fragile. And in that chaos, I saw them. The shadows rose higher than I had ever witnessed before, towering silhouettes woven from the storm's spray and the night's blackness. They were no longer faceless. In the lightning's brutal flashes, I glimpsed hints of forms too human to be coincidence. Arms outstretched, eyes hollow, mouths open in voiceless hunger. They were us. Or, rather, they were what we might become, if silence consumed every memory, every word, every song. The realization struck harder than the storm itself. The shadows weren't only some ancient hunger, some alien force hidden within the sea. They were the echo of humanity erased, every forgotten voice folded into silence, twisted into something that no longer remembered itself. We had always feared the ocean's appetite, but perhaps its greatest cruelty was not in drowning bodies. It was in drowning meaning. The storm pressed tighter, the air searing my lungs with salt and lightning. But I could not unsee what I had glimpsed. Those forms were warning as much as they were threat. If silence won, if the rhythm faltered, we would not vanish into nothing. We would join them. We would become shadows. The thought tore at me, but it also hardened my resolve. I screamed again, raw, my throat tearing. The lullaby came unbidden, fragments of it breaking between sobs and thunder, and the storm paused, not stopped, but staggered, like a creature struck in its core. The shadows recoiled, writhing violently, their outlines blurring as if the lightning itself sought to scatter them. But one lingered, closer than the others. Its face, if it could be called a face, was jagged, incomplete, as though memory had tried to hold on but failed. Its hollow gaze locked on me, and for an instant I felt its silence not as hunger but as sorrow. Not everything had been consumed. Something still lingered within it, buried deep. That was when I understood the final truth. The shadows were not simply devourers. They were also carriers. They held the fragments of what had been erased, buried beneath their silence. Perhaps even my voice, if lost, would be held within them, waiting for some future rhythm to awaken it again. They were not only warning, they were record. The reckoning, then, was not destruction. It was recognition. Humanity could not defeat silence, but perhaps it could learn to speak with it, to draw from it, to bend it back toward memory. We had feared being swallowed, but what if we were also being preserved? The storm roared, waves colliding with each other in towering chaos, but now I screamed not only with defiance, I screamed with invocation, calling the shadows not away, but closer. The closest one wavered, its silence pressing against me with unbearable weight. But in that weight I felt something else, a rhythm buried so deep it was almost forgotten, a fragment of song, a trace of voice. They hadn't left us clues, they hadn't left us guidance, they had left us warnings, and in those warnings, a mirror. The storm heaved again, the ocean's vast chest rising in fury, but I no longer feared being drowned, because even if my voice broke, even if I was silenced, the rhythm would not end. It would continue, carried forward by the very shadows that haunted us. And as the lightning split the sky once more, I realised the final twist of it all. The ocean had never sought to erase us entirely. It had sought to remind us. The thought cut through me with a strange calm, a clarity that neither the storm nor the shadows could shake. For so long we had believed the sea to be a graveyard, an endless hunger that swallowed all without mercy. But what if it was also an archive, a living vault where voices lingered, where memory was reshaped rather than destroyed? Erasure was never absolute. It was transformation. I floated in the chaos, battered by waves, half drowned in spray, but within me the fear shifted. The ocean's silence was no longer pure void. It was layered, complex, heavy with what it carried. Beneath its hunger was a strange kind of generosity, the preservation of what we lost, though not in the forms we would have chosen. Our cities might be ruins, our songs broken, but fragments lived on in the rhythm of the tide, in the echoes hidden within shadows. The storm pressed harder, its fury a test, but now I listened differently. Every crash of thunder, every hiss of foam against my ears held cadence. The ocean was reminding me not of endings, but of continuity. It was telling me that survival was not permanence. It was renewal, again and again, even through destruction. I thought of the civilizations before us, the ones swallowed by floods, buried beneath waves, lost to silence. We imagined them gone, erased completely. But perhaps they had only been folded inward, their rhythms stored, waiting. Perhaps that was why I had glimpsed human shapes in the shadows, echoes of those who came before, blurred but still there. They had not disappeared. They had become memory woven into silence. And so, I wondered, what would we become? If humanity faltered, if our voices dimmed and the shadows claimed us, what fragments would endure? Would our words still whisper through the tide? Would our rhythm still break storms centuries from now? Would another lone voice rise, carried by the same waters, to find us waiting in the silence? The thought was haunting, but oddly comforting. Death, silence, oblivion. They were not final. They were another form of carrying forward, one we did not fully understand. The reckoning was not about whether we could escape the ocean. It was whether we could learn to live within it, to trust that even if we were swallowed, we were not truly lost. The storm began to soften, its rage thinning into rain. The shadows receded, their outlines fading, but I no longer saw them as pure threats. They were reminders of what could happen if we forgot, yes, but also guardians of what had already been. And in their silence, I sensed not triumph, but waiting. They were patient, endlessly patient, because they knew time belonged to them. I closed my eyes, rain streaming down my face, and let my voice rise once more. Not a scream this time, not defiance, just a quiet song, the lullaby carried by memory. My words fell into the waves, small against their immensity, but I knew they would not vanish. They would be stored, carried, folded into the silence. Perhaps someone far in the future would hear them again, faint but alive, and know we had been here. The horizon glowed faintly now, the first edge of dawn piercing through the storm's ragged veil. I watched as the light touched the sea, turning its surface to molten silver. The rhythm lingered still, deep beneath, hidden but unbroken. Humanity's future was uncertain, but in that moment I understood we were never entirely alone. The ocean carried us, the silence remembered us, and as the rain eased, leaving only the slow pulse of waves, I let go of fear. Whatever came next, whether survival, transformation, or silence, it would not be an ending, it would be another reminder. The dawn unfolded across the ocean like a slow awakening, light scattering across the restless skin of the water. Every ripple caught fire, every crest shimmered with the faintest trace of warmth. I floated there, weary but calm, and for the first time since the oceans had begun their vanishing, I understood the vastness differently. It was not just a space of loss, it was a space of keeping, of carrying forward. And though the shadows had pressed me to the edge of despair, I now felt them as part of a larger whole. They were memory in its most haunting form. They were us, as much as they were other. The silence no longer pressed with suffocating weight. It lingered, yes, but it no longer felt final. It was waiting, like soil holding seeds, like night holding stars. What we had believed erased was not truly gone. It had been folded inward, transformed, waiting for the right voice, the right rhythm to call it back into being. I thought of the voices I had carried with me, my grandmother's song, my own broken words, the fragments of rhythm that had threaded through my veins even when fear threatened to extinguish them. None of it had been wasted. None of it had been lost. Every sound, every breath became part of the ocean's eternal archive. Humanity, fragile as it was, would always leave traces. The question now was not whether we would survive unchanged, but whether we would recognise ourselves in what remained. Would we learn to see silence not as an enemy, but as a mirror? Would we remember that even in vanishing we continue? Or would we blind ourselves again, fearing the darkness, and in doing so give it power? The storm had broken, but I knew storms would come again. The silence would surge, shadows would rise, and reckoning would always return. Yet I no longer felt the weight of inevitability. I felt continuity. Every reckoning was also a reminder, and every reminder was a chance to remember differently. The ocean breathed around me, steady now, its rhythm undeniable. I let my body drift with it, no longer resisting, and closed my eyes. Somewhere beneath, the shadows waited, carrying all that had been lost. Somewhere within, my voice lingered, ready to thread itself into the tide. And somewhere beyond, in futures I would never see, others would rise and listen. Perhaps they would hear me. Perhaps they would hear all of us. The day the oceans disappeared was not the end of the world. It was the world teaching us what we had always tried to forget, that nothing vanishes without leaving something behind, that silence itself remembers, that even in drowning there is a rhythm that carries forward. And so, I leave you with these questions. If the oceans themselves remember us, what is it they want us to remember in return? When silence presses hardest, do we fight it, or do we listen to what it hides? Could our own voices one day become shadows, waiting in the deep for others to find? And if so, then will they hear us as warnings or as reminders? Share your thoughts below, and if you're new here, subscribe to Planet Echoes so you don't miss the next journey into the mysteries of our hidden past.